Hello. Just really quickly before I start, I'd like to say thank you to my thesis committee members, Maria McVarish, Susan Gevertz, Francis Richards, and Maria Porges. I can't see anybody, so I don't know where you're sitting, but thank you. And I'd also like to say thanks to Michelle for shepherding us through this process, and also to the Chalk Hill residency program, which I had an opportunity to do a residency at the end of the summer, right before the thesis project started, and a lot of the ideas in this thesis were born in that residency. So those thank yous aside, I'm ready to begin. Okay. In April of 1970, the sculptor Robert Smithson built a spiral-shaped jetty out of 6,650 tons of rock on the Great Salt Lake. By 1973, the water level of the lake had risen high enough that the jetty was completely submerged, not to resurface for another 3 decades. In August of 2007, I had the opportunity to visit. I made sure to get there before sunset. I'd gotten lost the night before, wandering around in the dark, looking for another earthwork, Nancy Halt's sun tunnels. I located Smithson's sculpture without a problem, but I still found myself disoriented. What was most shocking, besides the pink, white, and blue color scheme, which this video does no justice, was the near total silence. For a long time, all I could hear was the wind. Eventually, I heard a small splish-splash, like a tiny, passive kid waving his hands around in the bathtub. It turned out to be a pair of pelicans several hundred feet away. The pelicans helped to ground me, helped me to locate myself, as did the crunch of my feet against the salt crystals, at least somewhat. I realized as I walked the length of the jetty, however, that I had no name for the place that I occupied, a place between submergence and reemergence, somehow frozen in time, but continuous. Later, when I read that Smithson had made the analogy between a spiral and a reel of film, I realized where I'd been, caught somehow in the gap between filmic frames, waiting for the action, and yet also a part of it. What is cinematic time? It is not just a question of technique or a projector and a reel of film, but a combination of a technical apparatus and a conceptual one. Using film scholar and semiotician Marianne Doan's discussion of cinematic time, along with the writings of contemporary film editor Walter Murch, I juxtapose Robert Smithson's Spiral Jetty and Abby Warburg's Der Bilder Atlas Mnemosyne, or Picture Atlas Mnemosyne, arguing that, 1, cinematic time can be found in other media besides film, and 2, that spatial projects like Spiral Jetty and Warburg's Der Bilder Atlas exploit the inherent tensions found in cinema by inviting viewers to consciously occupy the place of the cut or gap. Consider the fact that for thousands of years, philosophers debated about whether time was one constant interval or flow, or a series of discontinuous moments. Among other things, what's at stake in how we understand and represent time is how we construct our idea of self. If time is a series of individual, separate moments, what keeps me constant from moment to moment? Now consider the fact that the modern era saw an explosion in available definitions of time. From Isaac Newton's statement that time passes uniformly, illustrated by a continuous line of smoke, to Albert Einstein's theory that the perception of time is relative to its system of measurement. Each ball here represents a separate moment in time that could be interpreted differently depending on the location of its viewer. Rather than an immediate transition from the belief in one mode of time to another, the result was a carefully orchestrated juggling act. We seemed to embrace all models at once, to hold on to the sense of a uniform public time, even as we tried to understand time's connection to contingency, i.e. accident or chance. The technology of cinema, with its ability to record and replay the ephemeral moments that make up daily life, not to mention control their sequence, has been particularly suited to represent these tensions. This is especially true for the ideas of instant and interval, both of which are present in the film body itself, a series of discontinuous stills that, when played at 24 frames per second through a projector, give the illusion of one continuous interval of time. Cinematic time, then, is a time based on fragmentation and iteration, on discontinuity and the illusion of synthesis. It is also a time based in space, in the location of the gap between film stills or the cuts that an editor makes. Walter Murch, perhaps one of the most prominent film editors of the last few decades, Murch edited Apocalypse Now, among other things, describes this process as a total and instantaneous displacement of one field with another. It is the site of this displacement that spatial projects such as the Spiral Jetty and Warburg's Picture Atlas invite us to occupy. To walk the jetty is to physically occupy the gap between film stills. While in film, these gaps last a fraction of a second, the gaps that occur whenever the jetty is submerged can last decades, resulting in an illusion of stasis. With Der Bilder Atlas, however, Warburg functioned as a traditional editor, cutting or arranging and rearranging groups of images on black burlap panels in a process akin to montage, or the ordering of images in space. And I'm going to go off script here and say that he did this for a period of 5 years as a daily practice. Warburg, an early 20th century art historian, hoped to understand why a particular style of representation or type of image would surface and resurface at different points in history or in different cultures. He even named his project Mnemosyne, after the Greek goddess of memory. Warburg was convinced that meaning only existed in the relationship between things, not within things themselves. And he converted his philosophy into an organizational technique called the law of the good neighbor. He used this technique to structure both his picture atlas and his private library, which eventually became the Warburg Institute, one of the more important art historical think tanks of the 20th century. Instead of ordering books or images alphabetically or chronologically, Warburg would sequence and resequence them so that, in the words of philosopher Giorgio Agamben, a line of speculation opening in one volume was attested to or attacked, continued or contradicted, refined or refuted in its neighbor. Each book was to answer or ask a question of the one next to it. Or, to use Murch's language, the meaning of one neighbor displaces the next. Panel 77, for example, shows gestures of extension and constriction from different time periods, based around the two paintings by Eugène Delacroix in the upper left corner, Medea and the Massacre at Chios. The gestures are disturbing. Medea has one child by the throat. Her left hand clenches a dagger, and her left forearm pins the second child against her. Medea's restrained violence is a formal counterpoint to the newspaper clipping of a female golfer with a raised club to her immediate right. And there are more echoes of this gesture throughout the panel, from the outstretched arms of a Nike figure in a German toilet paper advertisement circa 1920, to the pointing charioteer on a Syracusan coin. Similarly, Warburg traces the reappearance of the taut spiral of a child trying to nurse from his dead mother in Delacroix's Massacre at Chios, juxtaposing it with snakes writhing through hair on yet another Syracusan coin. Based on these juxtapositions, Warburg could have been thinking of the diffusion of these gestures' power over time. Alternatively, it could be extrapolated that he was working through the idea of some sort of imbalance of national power, i.e., through images of a mother killing her children or a child feeding from a dead parent. I base this reading, I based this reading on Warburg's experience as a member of the Jewish community in Hamburg during the early part of this century, as well as the fact that he created these panels between World War I and World War II. Ultimately, however, Warburg's specific intention with Panel 77, as with the rest of his atlas, remains difficult to access. The meaning and our attention, or occupation, remains lodged in the gaps between the images, as well as between Warburg and his audience. More than anything else, what stands out in looking at the panels is their preponderance of negative space. The opaque black of the burlap cloth provides a universal ground, no matter which panel you investigate, filling the gaps between neighboring images and creating a variety of frames. The amount of negative space varies from panel to panel, just as the gaps between the images vary in size from negligible to several inches wide. The result is that on some panels, the images look like archipelagos afloat in a vast black sea. On others, the images look like leaves strewn so thickly that one almost fails to see the sidewalk underneath. Rather than giving us the illusion of continuous movement, as in film, or the illusion of stillness, as with the spiral jetty, Warburg literally freezes his zones of displacement. Whereas in life, Warburg could not stop shuffling through the images. After his death in 1929, the panels of his picture atlas remain available to us only as a series of stills. As one might expect from projects 50 years apart in time, Aby Warburg's Der Bilder Atlas Mnemosyne and Robert Smithson's Spiral Jetty manifest cinematic time in ways that both overlap and diverge. Our physical ability to drive to Utah and walk out onto the jetty is one difference. The wooden frames and black burlap that created the panels of the picture atlas were lost when Warburg's library was shipped to London during World War II, and the images that Warburg used were placed out of sight in the archives of the Warburg Institute. But the jetty is also prone to disappearance. Submerged for its first 3 decades, it was only accessible via Smithson's essays, photographs, or film. Arguably, the jetty is more successful in enabling us to physically inhabit the site of the gap or cut, but ultimately, the confusion of forms shared by the jetty and Der Bilder Atlas is just one more example of the ways in which both projects manifest cinematic time. Thank you.